Education involves each of our 6 foundations. We need to understand truth, identity, community, hope, and influence, so we can take a stand for the gospel in a culture that is increasingly hostile towards Christians. Instilling a biblical worldview in the next generation is crucial. I'm your host, Aaron Miller, pastor of equipping at Grace Baptist Church in Santa Clarita, California. Welcome to the Magnify podcast. Well, thanks so much for joining us, my friends. Once again, we're joined here by our senior pastor and friend, David Haig. And this week, we're going to talk about education, not in a formal sense, per se, but education that takes place in the home and in the church that instills the Christian worldview in ourselves and in the younger generation. Dave, thanks for being here, man.
I love these things, man. These are good. I'm learning stuff from what we say and what your other guests say as well.
You say things and then you listen to yourself. And, man, that was really good.
No, my wife does.
So, David, let's just kind of go back to the beginning because we're coming to the end of our time reviewing the foundations of faithfulness. But what was stirring in your heart when you wrote the Foundation of Faithfulness sermon series? Like, what were you seeing and sensing in our culture, in our church, in your own heart?
Yeah, I think if anybody has been watching culture and listening and reading the news and hearing what's going on with the cancel culture and all kinds of things, we see that the pressures are growing on any worldview, any philosophy that doesn't fit kind of a no-holds-barred philosophy. Mm-hmm. So the idea right now is that everything is unrestrained. Sexuality is unrestrained. Who you want to identify as is unrestrained. We've shifted from having a society that sees truth as outside of us that we're accountable to. That is, whether it's in the pagan world, there are pagan gods that you have to keep placated through your sacrifices, or any of the major religions. All of them have the idea that we each individually are accountable to something outside ourselves. Mm-hmm. Well, that's completely changed. Now we don't have accountability outside ourselves. We get to define who we are. We get to define what right and wrong are. And as a result, the Christian worldview is now looked upon as a great threat. It used to be that we were told as Christians, this is great. We're glad you guys are moral. We have lots of religions. They'll all just kind of live together in pluralism. Mm. And then it went to, and you know what, you Christians, it's okay for you guys to have a biblical worldview about morality and sexuality and right and wrong and good and evil and all that, but keep it to yourself. Don't bring it out into the public square. Mm-hmm. Well, that's changed.
Right.
Now it's, you can't even believe that. If you believe that, then you are, you're somewhat of an emotional terrorist. We're now seen as a threat. And as a threat, eventually, we're going to be in the place that the second century church was in. Mm-hmm. And so I went back and studied the second century church. How did they deal with the Roman Empire that was against them? Well, they reverted back to the essentials.
What was that book that you read?
It was Christianity at the Crossroads.
That's
by
right.
Michael Kruger, and it's Christianity in the second century. And basically out of that book, I distilled, anybody could have done it. It was right there. Truth. They doubled down on truth. Because what we see happening, and we've already done these podcasts on truth, but what we see happening right now in the Christian world, in the evangelical world, is that they're shaving the edges off of truth so that they don't offend anybody. Well, that's not what we need to do. We just need to have the truth and shave the edges off our rhetoric.
Yeah.
Okay.
Good way to
and then identity, that is the big issue right now. Who are we? And as we said in our podcast, God has already spoken about that. Our identity starts with who we are and who we've been made to be in the image of God. And then we fell into sin, but in Christ, we have a new identity in Christ, and that's the most important thing about us. And when that happens, then you realize, man, if the most important thing about me is that I'm in Christ, then the most important family I have outside of my biological family is the family of God.
Is the church, yeah.
So that's what we've come up with, and today we're talking about education, and it's all about how are we going to make sure that ourselves, our parents, and the next generation understands these things in a way that is going to allow them to thrive and stand for Christ in the midst of a culture that really wants to cancel us. That's what this is all about.
So when it comes to families in our church, what is one thing families could start doing that would help instill the biblical worldview?
Man, they need to know the Bible, and we're going to help them do that. And a lot of them do. Mm-hmm. But they also have to understand that biblical knowledge has to be lived out in biblical ethics. And we have to do that in this podcast. We're talking about education. It's very important that parents see the church as not just a nice to have or a place that their kids can go and have fun, but as an essential component in resourcing them and teaching the kids, along with the parents, what the biblical worldview is. The way I look at it is, a lot of times, the way I was raised even, I went to Sunday school and I learned all the stories, but I didn't learn why they were important. I didn't learn, for instance, what David and Goliath, my favorite because my name's David, I didn't learn what that meant with regard to who God is and what God was doing at that time in Israel and how he was preparing David to be his king, and that David as king was a forerunner of Jesus as Messiah. See, we've got to put all these things in the biblical story, and we've got to show kids that you obey not because you're afraid not to obey, but that you do what God asks you to do because God knows what's best for you.
Well, before we were recording this podcast, I believe you were in a discussion when I walked in, just talking about the joy of obedience. Like we've missed that somehow.
Well, and I think fundamentalism really played a huge role in ruining obedience, because a fundamentalist says, look, do this, and don't do that and that and that. Be known for what you don't do. If you don't do enough bad things, and if you do enough good things, then your life's going to be great. Well, then, as a 14, 15-year-old, I did some bad things, and guess what? Nothing happened. So I can't just do it to keep God off my back. That's more of a Roman Catholic view, okay? That God of the Old Testament, Roman Catholicism is often seen as the religion of Moses. You've got a law, you keep it. If you break it, then you go and you tell somebody you did it, and you pay some penance, and you say some Hail Marys. But that's not the New Testament. The New Testament is you come to Jesus Christ and you realize that he has rescued you, and he's your Lord, and you love him. And so obedience it's the same way in my marriage. Why do I do things for Sherilyn? Because I love her. I don't do it to make her love me. I do it because she already loves me. So we want to obey God because, number one, he knows better than we do. And if we understand who God is, that he knows all things and everything he asks of us is always best and right, then whether we can see it or not, obedience is our best option. But you were asking, what can parents do? I think one of the things we have to reinstitute is what we'd call family devotions. Right. I think dads have to get the family around, maybe at breakfast, maybe at dinner, read the Bible and explain the Bible to their kids, and talk about things. Ask the kids, what are you seeing at school that bothers you?
Right.
And begin to interact with our children with regard to how they're viewing life, whether it's broken or not, and what God can do about it.
And I think it's important for families not to stress out about this.
Right.
Because you just start small.
Yeah.
You go slow, and you scale it according to your family and your family rhythm. And there's no one way to do this.
I think it's also good for Christian families to have other Christian families they do things with. I think it's great for our kids to see that there are other adults and other kids who are in this together. That's where we get this idea of community.
Right. So we're encouraging families not just to grow in their knowledge of the Bible, but to live out the Scriptures, right? To live Bible in front of their kids joyfully. That's gonna have an echo that will go through the decades in those children's lives. Absolutely. What are we prepared to do as an institution, as a church, as a body?
Yeah, and I think what I was just saying a few minutes ago is that we're gonna teach our kids the whole biblical story, and we're going to take some of the Old Testament stories and some of the parables and things and make sure that kids understand this is talking to us about who God is. And God is real. And this is the nature of God, and these are the attributes. We're already tearing down walls to literal walls in our
Right.
building so that we can have large group teaching times for our elementary school kids. We're redoing the curriculum, and we're looking and saying, okay, how do we bring the biblical worldview into these kids' lives in a way that makes sense at every age, rather than just try to babysit them for 45 minutes. They color a page and
Right.
they learn the story. These guys caught a bunch of fish.
Right.
How does that fit into who God is and how we're supposed to live? And mostly we want to demonstrate joyful worship, joyful obedience. We want them to see that being a Christian is not something that you do and give up a bunch of stuff. Following Christ is a privilege that allows you to really thrive the way our lives were meant to thrive.
Do you remember your 3 R's? We want kids to know that God is
Real,
that he is right, and that he is reliable.
Oh, yeah, those are good. Man, I came up with those. Wow. Yeah, he's real.
That's just another example, Dave. You say things and you're like, man, that was really good.
Yeah.
But I think the other things that we're also doing, certainly with the children and the students, we have discipleship, education outcomes, if you will. It's probably a better way to say that. But we have desired states when it comes to raising our kids in the church. But outside of those ministries, even with our men and our women, I'm thinking about looking forward to the fall as we're planning things like a businessman's luncheon, helping men understand that vocationally they have an opportunity to live out the biblical worldview in the domain that God has called them to.
Yeah, and I think we have to be very, very skilled at doing it. The time when you could be a Christian and just be kind of flaunting it and a smash mouth at work and taking everybody on, probably never should have happened, but certainly it's over now. And I think what we have to do is we have to relationally ask questions and demonstrate through our lives what we believe. In Peter it says, be ready always to give an answer to anyone who asks about the hope that's in you. Well, what that means, I believe, in our day, when in some places it's going to be more dangerous to be a Christian. I mean, in the entertainment world right now, if you don't go in with the narrative of the LGBTQ, whatever, if you don't agree that that is true, and that's a narrative that you should, continue to put forward, you're going to be in trouble.
Right.
So what you have to do is you have to lead with your life. And when someone says, how come you do the things you do, then out of a relational foundation, then you start sharing, well, this is who I am.
Right.
This is why I'm the way I am. And I think you come up against those who are, holding to this radical secular narrative, and you just come up against them, not going to war with them and not withdrawing from them. We've done this before,
Sure.
but you want to be a winsome witness, and you want to ask questions.
Well, that's what made C.S. Lewis and Francis Schaeffer so successful as proponents of the Christian worldview. They had the
Absolutely.
ability to listen and to have meaningful conversation with people. So what you're describing is really marks of how to do gospel listening and how that might then influence gospel sharing. You're slowing down and you're becoming conversant with that Christian worldview.
Yeah, I think right now I see a lot of believers kind of saying, man, I don't want to get involved with anybody who thinks differently.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to stay away from them. I'm kind of afraid of them. I really don't know how to interact with them. And when I do interact with them, I just get mad. So I'm just going to stay away from them. That withdrawal idea is just not what Jesus wants. So I had a guy come up after the first service. And if you remember, I did a little thing at the beginning about the sanctity of life and the whole abortion question. And I read some quotes by medical professionals that, anybody who's playing with an open medical book and has any experience knows that at conception there is a life. And it's not anything other than a human life. It's not some other kind of life. It's a human life. So abortion ends a human life. And so, we prayed for the Supreme Court that they would, make their decisions based on natural law and common sense and integrity and right and wrong from a biblical worldview. Well, this gentleman came up. It's his first time in church. He's just lives down the road, and he said, I've never heard, he was at least in his late 40s. He said, I've never heard that abortion was wrong.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow.
And that stunned me. And so I asked him questions. I said, well, what do you think? and I listened. And then I kind of said, well, what about this? What about that? And by the time we were done, he was going, I never thought of that. And, he got into the rape and incest thing. And then I said, well, so does it make sense that the baby has to pay for that? And he had never heard that. So my whole point was that when we interact with people and we can ask good questions and listen and empathize with the fact that, for instance, abortion is a really tough subject. Mm-hmm. It's not simple, especially for women. And so we have to empathize, we have to step into their world, listen, and then, winsomely present our position. And here's what we're going to find. People have never heard our position. They have characterized Christians as you're just against everything. And so we have to step into their world and say, I want to listen to you.
Yeah.
And I want to feel the angst that a woman feels.
Yeah.
So,
I mean, brothers and sisters, that's so important. I just want to pause there for a second because I think there's real value in learning to listen well. That for the most part in our Christian culture, I see Christians, in terms of their listening methods, it's defensive listening, it's selective listening, it's not attentive, it's certainly not empathetic.
It all comes back to this whole idea, do you love your enemies?
Exactly.
I mean, Jesus said, love your enemies. Pray for those who spitefully use you. If someone slaps you on one side, let them slap the other side. I mean, if they ask to go to 1 mile with you, go 2 miles with them.
Right.
When did that become something we don't obey? When did we decide that it's okay and even good to malign our opponents, to defame them, to try and shame them, and to go to war with them? Jesus said, go be my witnesses. So this whole idea of education, we have to educate all of our people, not just the kids,
right,
but educate them in how do we interact with a society that God still wants to save, right? It's not like he's giving up on America. He didn't give up on Rome.
Right.
And the church winsomely and courageously and truthfully in community, they just were the church. And that's really what we're trying to do.
So what other areas of our culture would you say our people need to be more attentive in recognizing as cultural influencers?
Yeah, well, one of the things we have to be very careful to see through the labels that a secular culture uses. For instance, they label abortion as female health care.
Sure.
It's not health care.
Right.
And this whole idea of freedom, the idea of freedom today is no limits, no restraints. But what we know is that there has to be some restraint in order for there to be real freedom. If you've got kids, you put a fence around your yard so that they have freedom within the fence. You take the fence away, and they don't have freedom, they have chaos. So there's got to be law, there's got to be, understanding. I'm going through the wisdom pyramid again, and Brett McCracken does a whole section on if everything is possible, then nothing is right.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah,
if everything is okay, nothing is wrong.
Right.
And that's where we're living. So this idea of freedom, we as Christians have to understand that freedom is found within boundaries, within restraint, and not buy into the cultural idea that, no, we got to get rid of all restraints. The only restraint I should have is whether I'm happy or not. Man, don't let your kids fall into that. The other one might, we've talked about identity. Human dignity is really going, it's going downhill. If I get to decide what I am, then I don't really have a position of dignity in your eyes. So dignity comes when we all realize something we have in common, that human life, regardless of whether it's male or female, old or young, has dignity not because of what we decide we are, but what God has said we are. I've said this a lot to my classes at the Masters University. When Darwin came in and said, I can explain the existence of all things without God, what he did was he forever dishonored what God created, because what God created has value because God created it.
Right.
All creation, but especially human life. So if human life is not the pinnacle of God's creation because we're made in his image, if we are just this random collection of atoms, and if in the womb we're just a non-viable tissue mass,
Right.
you're just seeing human dignity go downhill, and we're seeing that not only in abortion, but we're seeing it in all kinds of manipulation of humanity. We're seeing it in the skyrocketing suicide rates,
Right.
the murder and mayhem. We just read an article, some guy in Chicago or someplace just went and shot a bunch of homeless guys just for fun.
Yeah. No, it's absolutely true. I mean, how that then translates morally, if we are just, of all of life, the universe is just random collisions of matter, then there is no right and wrong because there's no rhythm, there's no order. It's all chaos.
And we're watching that. But I think we're also, because of natural law, you can't undo natural law. There are things that, as Paul says, are written on our hearts. In Romans 1, he says, in creation, God's eternal power and his nature are clearly seen. Although it's repressed in unrighteousness, it's still there. I think everybody knows that when bombs hit a maternity hospital and it kills a mom who's trying to give birth and it kills the baby, we know that's wrong intuitively. And so I think this absurdity that there's no right and wrong we're going to push back on it. I think our culture is going to push back on it because, quite frankly, we can't live with that mindset. So we as Christians, we have to jump on that train and say, yes, you know it's wrong. You know why? We know why it's wrong.
Yeah.
Because there is a God who created. But if you are in line with him, if you find refuge with him in Jesus Christ, suddenly you're going to see things and understand things in the way that God meant them to be seen and understood.
What else are you seeing?
I mean, obviously, sexuality.
Oh, well, that's rampant.
I mean, I've said before, I'm kind of glad I'm not raising kids right now. Because the number one thing is that your sexuality is, they'll tell, the world is telling us that's the most important thing about you. That's what defines you. You're defined as heterosexual, homosexual, bisexual, pansexual. Well, that's not who you are. That's not who I am. What I'm saying is that's one component of humanity, but being a human is much greater, much bigger than my sexuality, especially if you are a single person and you're not involved with sexual intimacy.
We got into that a little bit when we discussed identity, right?
Yes.
We have a truth giver, therefore we know that there is truth. We have identity because we have an identity giver. And so what we've done in our culture, we've taken identifiers and we've made them ultimate, right? And so when we're talking about the Imago Dei, being made in the image of God, that being the capstone by which everything else then builds on, right? Especially now that we're called, those of us who are in Christ, we're called by Christ and indwelled with the Holy Spirit. That becomes our main identity, our ultimate identity.
Absolutely.
And when we take sexuality and we make that supreme, man, that's gonna turn on that individual. And literally, according to the wisdom literature, Ecclesiastes, Solomon's saying you turn inward and you begin to feast on your own flesh. Right? You have no moral compass at that point.
Yeah, and to piggyback on what I said about Darwin, when Darwin did away with God, he basically left humanity without a purpose. So Dr. Freud moved in and said, well, I can tell you the purpose of life is happiness. The greatest happiness is sexual. Mm-hmm. And so from there, we've decided as a human race, right, I am here to be happy. The goal of life is happiness. And if sexuality affords me the greatest happiness, then sexuality defines my identity. Well, the problem is, once you decide that being happy is the purpose in life, number one, you're never going to be happy enough. Right. Number two, you're going to find out that adversity is a certainty in this world. This is a broken world. What's wrong with this world is the one thing that almost all religions have in common. They don't see this world as nirvana or whatever. We aren't living in paradise. We're living in a quagmire of man's inhumanity to man. And the news tells us about it all the time. So given that, we can't see our identity based on our own happiness. We've got to see our identity based on God's creative purpose in us, which is to glorify him. And when we glorify him, we're going to find meaning and purpose even in adversity.
God knew what he was doing. He knows what's good for us.
He knows what's good for us.
Just trust him.
Yeah.
Well, Dave, this has been real fun. I mean, we're kind of wrapping the series up. I think we have one more as we continue to flesh out what education looks like in the home and in the church that we're going to get into next week. But I just want to thank you for the time and the effort and all the work. I mean, folks, Dave graciously gives up his pulpit to people like Jared Burkholder and myself and Joe Culler and other guest speakers. He doesn't have to do that. That's not required for him to do that. But he graciously does that. And in that, I just need you to know, as brothers and sisters, he does all that work. I mean, I'm simply writing on the notes and the studies of his effort. So thank you. Love you, appreciate you. Before we sign off, any resources you want to leave the people with?
You know, I mentioned The Wisdom Pyramid by Brett McCracken way back when we were talking about truth and community, and I'm rereading it right now. I just got to tell you, parents, get that book and read it. It's going to help you understand where your kids are going to get their information. And they're going to start with their phones and the internet and TikTok and Instagram and anything else they can text with their friends. You got to understand, they got to start with the Bible, and that comes from you. So that's a good one. Also, in the Biblical Worldview, the James Sire's book, The Universe Next Door, it's a little older, but it's very, very good. And then I would also suggest, for those of you who really want to get into it, there's a book called What We Can't Not Know by Jay Bujashevsky, and the J there is just J period. He is a believing sociologist, historian at the University of Texas in Austin, and he's written a couple of books, but that one, I think every parent should read it.
It's a great resource. Well, brothers and sisters, thank you for listening. Next time, we will come together and we will actually wrap up our very first season of the Magnify podcast. But hope you'll be able to join us next time.